The Entra-ID authentication flow in the Power Platform for the SAP OData connector enables you to leverage a modern single sign-on authentication flow. In the last video, we showed the happy path. Within 20 minutes, you can set up a production-ready single sign-on configuration leveraging a sophisticated policy in Azure API management. But in a lot of cases, not everything is prepared in the backend system, and sometimes errors happen. So in this video, we will start again from scratch, but then go step by step, do lots of tests and verifications in between, and again end up with a full setup. The goal is not only to explain and understand the main building blocks of the policy that we use in API management, but also to show you the flexibility that this brings. The policy can be used as is, but you can also adjust it to your very own specific needs. Unlike in the previous video, we will start from the Power Platform and then create the required applications and registrations in Entra-ID and in the SAP system on the way. This will help you to understand the concepts and allow you to do your own modifications if required. To simplify troubleshooting, we will send requests to a public endpoint. You should not do this in a production environment unless you are sure that only you have access to these endpoints. If you don't want to do this, then you can always skip the tracing steps in the new policy. So let's get started. So the starting point is again this documentation, but actually we will turn it around. So we will start not from with the full Azure API management policy, but we'll start with a very simple API proxied in API management, and then gradually add additional features. So the initial step is actually in Azure API management, where we just create our OData service. And we give it a suffix name step by step. So with this API configured, if we actually go to API policies, we can take a look at the full policy. The first thing that we want to do is we want to hard code basically the username and password with which we will access the SAP backend system. So in my specific case, I'm just using here a user that I created in the backend system, Power Platform step by step with this very simple password. So I'll just save this. I actually, in my specific case, I need to do one change here, that this is an HTTPS URL. And I only want to have HTTPS communications. And now if I save this, and if I call this API here in a browser now, I have access to the business partner API without any authentication. So basically, or without any additional authentication. This is already now some kind of single sign-on. Obviously, we are using a hard-coded user, but this is single sign-on. So with this API, this is the business partner API. I could, for example, also really take a look at the business partners. So if I just take a look here at the A business partner, then you can see here all this long list of business partners. Go, and that's basically what I can use to navigate and create my Power Automate flow. So actually, let's quickly do this. Let's switch over to Power Automate. And here in Power Automate, I can create a new flow. I'll just create an instant cloud flow. We'll call this single sign-on from Power Platform. We'll call this, we'll use this with a manual trigger. And what we want to perform is we want to perform an OData call. So if I look for OData, we can see the SAP OData Service, and I want to start with the query operation. So the query operation allows me to query to an OData service like the business partner, and then to fetch a list of available business partners. Now, what I need to do first, I need to create the connection to my OData service. And one thing, we will again give it a name, single sign-on APIM. And here for the authentication type, we'll use Microsoft Entra-ID with APIM. we can provide the base URI. Base URI is this here, basically. But what we also need is the Microsoft Entra-ID resource URI, the application ID URI. So basically, in the next step, we first need to register an application that represents our Power Platform to API management flow. So with this, I go to portal.azure.com or just to the Entra-ID configuration. So I'm here in the previous Azure Active Directory, or now Entra-ID. I can go to application registration, and that's where I create a new registration. So I'll call this one HBR step-by-step power to APIM, and I just click on register. Now I already have here a client ID, which is important, which we should store, and I have the directory tenant ID. Actually, I will already save both of these entrants. So the tenant ID is this here. And again, this file here, this HTTP file is basically like a Postman script where I can perform REST calls. But here, especially in the first section, we'll just collect all the properties that are also relevant later on when we use the policy from my colleague Martin, who does much more than just the single sign-on flow. For now, we just have the tenant ID and the application ID. With these two things, that's already good. Now we can go back here to our registered API, and we can go to expose an API. Remember, we are looking for this application ID URI, and I can just add it up here. I can leave the default. I can click on save, and now I have this application ID URI. That is important for our Power Automate integration. I'll also immediately add a scope. So we'll call the scope user impersonation. We'll allow admin consent. We'll provide here the same display name and description. And I can just click on add. So with this, I have now the application URI, and I can go back to Power Automate. Or actually, let me just save this for now. This is the application URI that we'll need for later. So I'll just place this here as well. You can see there's also the user impersonation here. But for now, let's quickly go back to Power Automate and add here this Entra-ID. Remember, we don't really have single sign-on at the moment. We're just going to call the API. But actually, if I try to sign in, you'll see that I'm prompted for the username. Okay, so this user is the user that we will use for single sign-on later on. But you also see that I'm getting an error message that the client ID, and here's a new client ID, which is the representation of the Power Platform SAP OData connector, is not listed in the requested permissions. So what we need to do is we need to take this ID, and this ID is all documented, so it's all there. But we need to take this and we need to add this as a client that is allowed to be called here from the service. So I'll just add this. So now this client is added. And if I go back to Power Automate and if I just try to sign in again, then the sign is successful. We can see here's our new connector. And if I actually take a look at the available entities, I can see the entities from my SAP OData Service. So again, if I just take the business partner, maybe let's just take the top 5 services here. Let's save this, test the service. And we see the results. So we see here the top 5 business partners created in the SAP system. Keep in mind, again, this is not real single sign-on with this specific user. We have hard-coded the user in our API management system. But you can see here, so we have still hard-coded the user in our API management policy, but now we already have this flow from Power Automate via API management to our SAP backend system. Now, API management provides you with some monitoring capabilities, which allows me to take a look at the logs. When was the API called and stuff, something like that. So if I take a look here, I can actually see that this service, my step-by-step API, was successfully called, and I have some information on the service that was called. I have access to the backend system and so on, which is great. I have already now some information that the call was successful, and I could see actually the information in Power Automate. But maybe I want to get a little more insights on what's actually happening. And because of this, we will add additional logging directly in the policy. So if I go back to our policy, which is currently fairly empty, I will add a small snippet just before the authentication, which basically does an additional call out to an external site. The idea is that whenever the API is called, the policy is executed, and with this send request, I want to send some information. I can obviously define the header, I can define the body that should be sent out to this specific URL. Now, in my specific case, there are services like webhook.site or Pipedream, or you could even set up your own HTTP server that receives these incoming requests. In my scenario, I'm using Pipedream. So Pipedream is a public website basically that allows me to expose an HTTP receiver basically, and it just listens to incoming events and then displays these events on this web page. I would not recommend to do this in a productive setup, because obviously you will share secrets, credentials in this public website. So it's probably much better to set up your own HTTP server locally, or to go to another trusted site. In my specific case, I am using just demo data, and obviously after this recording, I'll delete all the configurations. So that's why I'm okay with this. But you should not do this in a productive setup. So in API management, now I have created here, or I've added here this policy snippet. It's basically just a tracing, which whenever this API is called, just calls the URL, and I'll go to this property in a second. It calls this URL, and it posts initial call from Power Platform, just for me as a reminder that this API has been called. So again, let me just save this, but here this HBR tracing URL, that's actually one of the named values that I have configured here. So I've created here the HBR tracing URL, and here you can see the URL to my Pipedream instance, which now means if I go again to Power Automate, if I test this flow again, so I'll just run it again. I will not only see here that the flow was successful, but actually if I go to my Pipedream instance, I can see two calls. One of these calls is here, this post message, and it says initial call from Power Platform. So this will be my easy way to trace what is actually happening in my policy. So we'll enhance this policy step by step, and at the end we will end up with the policy, or with the main steps of the policy that also Martin has created here, where we go through all the configuration steps to do the single sign-on flow. But actually, Martin's policy is much more sophisticated. So this is much more useful for a productive environment. But I hope that in going step by step, we can set up the skeleton policy that requires, or that does the relevant single sign-on steps, that does the authentication. And with this, you can understand how the policy actually works. So now that we have the first steps of the policies, let's actually continue with our registered application in order to use this registered applications also for manual testing. So not only from Power Automate, but also from a REST client. Let's configure here a redirect URI for signing OIDC. We'll use open access and ID tokens in this specific scenario. We don't need a logout URL, and I'll just configure this step. Now, what is the benefit here? Now I can actually test the very same flow that we just saw from Power Automate also in a REST client. I just need to log in and authenticate with our client ID. So basically what I'll do is I'll just use here this string. I will add here this new client. We have the sign in OIDC. We have the OpenID scope profile. That looks actually good. So what I can do now is I can just take this login authentication and use this to create an access token, very much like what Power Automate is doing. You might get here, or you will get here, what something might look like an error message, but actually what I got is this access token, and that's really the main thing. This is what Power Automate has been doing in the background. This is what I'm doing now manually, and this access token, that's actually what we really need. So if I go to a tool like DevToys, where I can take a look at the JOT token, I can see the JOT token that was now created. So I can, first of all, see here that we are using user impersonation. I can see here a unique name. So this is the user that was authenticated either in Power Automate or in my browser setup. And obviously this is the unique username that I will later on pass over to the SAP system, so that we can actually have a single sign-on to our SAP system. You can also see other information, like this is the tenant ID of my Power Automate or of my Entra-ID system. So this is what can all be used to make the single sign-on flow work. So this is great. So now we see the access token that we're getting, but now we want to convert this access token in an access token that actually works with my SAP OData Service. So the next thing that I need to do is I need to create a client certificate so that we can call this service in our next call and use the on behalf of flow to create or to get a SAML assertion. So what I'll do is I'll just create here a client secret for Power to API management. We'll just leave the 180 days. I mean, there are different options possible. I just click on add. And now I get here a client secret, or the value of the client secret here. It's very important that you remember this. So I will immediately add it here to my Power Automate, or to my REST client. And with this, I have the configuration on the Entra-ID side finished for now. So with this, we are ready to actually configure the SAP system. So on the SAP system, we now need to establish a trust between SAP and our Entra-ID system. What I will do first, if I go here to my SAP GUI, I can call the transaction SAML2. The transaction SAML2 opens up this URL here. And in my case, I already have the SAML provider configured. but you might need to run through the wizard once. Just when you go through the wizard to create your local provider, make sure to use a provider name that follows the URI specification, so HTTPS. In my specific case, I used the SID PM4 and the client 400. With this provider name, again, let me note this down. So this is the next thing. This is the Azure Active Directory SAP resource that we'll use in a second. But for now, I will just go in here and I will download the relevant metadata. The cool thing is, if I download all of this metadata, it has all the information of this specific setup. So now if I go back to Entra-ID and if I create enterprise application, this enterprise application needs to trust the SAP system, but instead of me providing all the information manually, I can just upload the metadata information with the information from the SAP system. So what I'll do is I'll click on New Application. I'll select SAP. I'll use an SAP NetWeaver system. And now I will call this enterprise registration HBR, SAP NetWeaver, step-by-step PM4. Let's click on Create. And now if I go to Manage and Single Sign-On, I can click on SAML, and here I can upload the metadata file from my SAP system. Now, a lot of information has already been pre-filled. So for example, like this local provider, the identifier that I had created before. So this is already fantastic. The other thing that we need to change actually is here this reply URL. In my specific case, we need to point this to the token provider. So what I'll do is I'll leave the server name, but I'll switch this to SAP BC Sec OAuth token, because that's where we will get our token from. Then for the sign out URL, we actually don't need that. So we'll just provide a dummy URL. And the only thing that you need to verify is actually this setting here. This looks all good. So it is pointing to SPSLO 400. Also the URL looks good. So with this, I can just click on Save. Now we are ready to actually perform the next step in our authentication. So remember, we had this JOT token. This was the token that we got calling here this login service manually in the browser. But if I take this token and if I just paste this here as the assertion, so this is now this token that we just got, I can now call the token service from Entra-ID and ask for an SAP a SAML assertion. So what I'll do is I'll just click here on Send Request, and I can call the service, but I'm actually getting an error message. I'm getting an error message that the administrator has configured the application, and this is exactly our application that's already good, to block users unless they are specifically granted. So it looks like the basic setup is correct, but we need to add additional authentications. So what I'll do is I'll go to our enterprise application. I go to users and groups, and I will add users that should be allowed to call this or leverage this enterprise application. In my specific case, I've already created a group called All Company. This company leverages the Power Automate user here. So I'll just add this specific user or this specific group, which now also obviously leverages the user. And I will go to our a registered application that we had before. Let me open this one here, the registered application. And I will also add additional API permissions. Oops. So I will add additional API permissions. So I'll click on Add Permissions. I go to APIs from my organization. I can search for HBR SAP NetWeaver. There is our enterprise application. I will select the permissions user impersonations, and I will add these permissions. Now, as you can see, admin consent is not yet set. So what I'll do is I will just click here on grant admin consent for all of these. And now you can see the consent is granted for these specific services. If I go back to my REST client, and if I just perform the very same call, so we're using the assertion that's actually here. This is just in this REST client, I've defined this assertion. And here you can see we're leveraging this specific assertion. In addition, we're using the client ID specified up here. So this was one of the first things that we copied. This is the client ID that we have down here. And then we also have the app secret, and up here the tenant ID. So again, if I perform the very same call, now you can see the call was successful. And I'm actually getting this access token. So this is, again, fantastic. I can just take this access token. You can take a look at this. So that's actually, this access token is base64 encoded. So I can just decode this, for example, with a base64 decode or something like that. Now I can take the resulting assertion. And if I take a look, this is the SAML assertion that I now got from Entra-ID. There are a lot of interesting things in here. So first of all, I can, for example, see the recipient that we had configured in our metadata file. I have here the audience, which is fantastic. This is the audience that we specified, the local provider. And I also see here the email address. So again, even this SAML assertion has, again, the email address, this unique identifier. I mean, obviously there are additional information down here. There's the names claim, there's the email claim and stuff like that. So, but in this SAML assertion, we still have all the relevant information that we need to later on configure our SAP system. So it looks like we are one step further, which is fantastic, which can now allow us to enhance our policy. So let me actually open here this named value section again. And if I search here for these named values, you can see that I have the resource here. We have the tenant ID. I need to update here the client value. So this is our client ID. Let me save that. Then we have the client secret. And yeah, in my case, this SAP resource is still the same. So that's all good. With these settings, let me go back here to the policy, and right after our tracing call, before the authentication call, I want to add an additional snippet here. So what we are doing here is we're first retrieving the values here from this named value pair. So we're retrieving the client ID, we're retrieving the client secret, we're retrieving the SAP resource. And then following our tracing methodology, we're just making another call to the trace. And this time we're basically setting this grant type. And if you remember, this is the very same thing as what we have here in our REST client. So here we are creating this grant type, which is for the request the SAML assertion, which we already tested manually. But now we want to have this specific call also in our API management policy. And that's what we are doing here just for debugging purposes. Because, for example, I recently had an issue where by mistake, we not only had the value like this, but we had one carriage return, one line feed, basically. And then the whole thing failed because obviously the ID was now a different one than this one. So that's why it can be quite helpful to have this very detailed tracing so that you can really see what's happening. So again, we'll trace this information, we'll write it out, and then we'll make the actual call. So we call here our login service. We set here the header variable with the grant type, and then as a result, and you can see here, this is the fetch SAML assertion step basically. So we'll take the fetch SAML assertion, and then once we execute this post call, we will put this SAML assertion, so this access token that we got from the SAML assertion, we'll put this in the access token, and then as a last tracing step, we will return this access token also to the tracing. Again, the very same thing as we did here manually. So we're calling the service, we put our assertion in here, we call the service, and then as a result, we get here this access token, which is basically the SAML assertion that we can then later on use to request the actual SAML token that we need to access the SAP system. So now we have updated our policy. Let's just save this. Let's actually also clear here our trace. Let's go back to Power Automate and run our call again. So we'll execute this flow. The flow is running and it succeeded. Again, keep in mind, we're not doing single sign-on. We still have hard-coded our username and password, but we're slowly getting there. Which means if we take a look at our pipe dream, we can see, first of all, okay, our initial call, which is good. Then we can see the grant type. So it looks like this is the very same thing that we also used in our manual call. And now as a result, we get here this access token. So what we can actually do, very much like before, we can just take this one. We can take a look here at this assertion. And as before, we see the information, so where we have the unique ID, where we have the token URL, and where we have all the other properties. So fantastic. So now our API management policy is not only able to fetch the to receive the assertion from Power Automate, but it is also able to trigger off the on behalf of call and get a SAML assertion back from Entra-ID. With this, we can actually request a token from the SAP backend system. So what we'll now do is we'll go back to Entra-ID, and in the first step we had imported the metadata information from SAP into Entra-ID. Now we'll do it the other way around. So from our enterprise app that we had created, so this HBR SAP NetWeaver SPS, we can actually also export relevant metadata information from here. So I'll export here the metadata XML, and I'm also exporting the certificate. Then we will go back to our SAML2 transaction, and then under trusted providers, you can select the OAuth 2.0 identity providers, and here I can add an additional provider. And this additional provider is our enterprise application. This enterprise application also needs a certificate. I can just leave the default settings here, and I can click on Finish. Now, the last thing that we need to do here is actually we need to tell the SAP system what is the unique identifier. And as we had seen before, this is our email address. So I'll select email here and click on OK. So now we have the first, let me actually save this and also enable this. Now we have the first step of the authentication or the trust done. The next thing is we need to create the OAuth configuration. So in order to do the OAuth configuration, I first need to create a new user in my SAP system. I'll call this user Hochbrucher SBS, and this user will be a system user, and we'll give it a very simple password. Again, after recording this video, I'll delete this user. I'll change the password and everything. So now we have created this user. Now the next thing is I need to go to the OAuth configuration screen. So I'll open up transaction S OAuth 2. Transaction S OAuth 2 will actually open up this URL here, and in here I can create now a new OAuth 2 client. So for this client, we will select our SPS user, the step-by-step user that we just created. We'll give it a name or a description, user for step-by-step single sign-on configuration. There's actually a token lifetime, which I will capture here in a second. So let me also add this variable in here. Let me go back. Then let's click on next, and just let's allow refresh token. And here for the trusted IDPs, we'll use the one that we just imported. So just make sure that really this is your tenant ID. Let me just double check. This is the tenant ID that we're working with. So as you can see, potentially SAP could be connected to multiple Entra-IDs. Just make sure that you have the right trusted provider. With this, we are at a step where we can specify a scope for this OAuth configuration. And this scope is very important because it basically determines which APIs can be called from or via this authentication flow. So if I go to IWFND main service, here I can see all the OData services in my SAP system. I could add additional services if there's a service that is not there yet. In my specific case, the business partner API is already there. And another thing is, this is already configured for OAuth. So this service has already all the relevant configurations done. If that would not be the case, then I could just click here on OAuth, and it would actually run me through this configuration step and enable this API or this OData services also for the OAuth configuration. So in my specific case, this is already done. So what I can just do is I can browse for the available services. So if I scroll down here, I can see this is my SAP API Business Partner 001. This is the scope for my OData service. So this is actually also something that I want to capture. So I'll just take this again and use this here as an update. Oh, and I forgot, obviously the username and the password of my SAP user should also be added here into this specific REST client here. Again, you can do the very same thing also with Postman. There, the setup is slightly different, but all the variables are the same. So with this information, let me actually just go back here and next and finish this so that we really have stored, that we saved this configuration here. We can make the next call and try to access to receive the token from our backend system. So if I do this, I still have here my access token for the SAML assertion call. So this one was just successful. And you can see here, this is the fetch access token for SAP and this fetch SAP token for SAP. So this is exactly the token that I have here. So if I now call my backend system, so this is the first time that we're now interacting with the SAP system. I call this OAuth token service. I provide the SAP username and the SAP password. I provide the client ID and the scope. So with all this, I can see that the request worked to some extent, but no user with email was found. So this is actually really, really great. We are already in the SAP system, but there is no counterpart for the specific email. So what I need to do is I need to assign this email to a specific user. So if I go here again to SU01, let me add this email address to an existing SAP user. Maybe this is already the case. Maybe you have already added all the users. But now there's a specific linkage between the incoming assertion. You saw the email address in the assertion that be there. And now this email address is mapped to this specific user. So if I make the call again, you can see the assertion has already been consumed. No problem. I'll just go back here to the previous call. I'll retrieve, or I'll get a new assertion, and I will call this again. Now, this time, we are actually getting an access token for this specific scope. So we have all the relevant information now to make our final call to the SAP system. I have an SAP access token. I am allowed to call this specific OData service, which means now, after calling here the token service, now I can actually really finally call my SAP Business Partner API. So I'm using this access token here. This access token is coming from access token from SAP. So this is exactly this access token from SAP. And if I call now this URL, I am getting the business partner information, or more specifically, I can also call here, let's say, the top 15 business partners from the SAP system. So with this, I now really have a single sign-on flow working. I am fetching the information. I'm triggering, or I'm calling the Entra-ID service to request a SAML assertion. With this SAML assertion, I'm calling the SAP backend token service to really request an access token. And with this access token, I can finally call my SAP system and or my SAP OData service and actually access this OData service with the right user credentials. So now that, again, we know this is working, let's go back to API management. In API management, we need to first update the information. So the SAP OAuth client ID, this is my Hochbruch SBS. We need to update the client secret. The client secret is this single sign-on setup. So this is also great. We might need to update the scope, but in my case, this scope is already set from a previous test run, basically. And then the only thing that is left is the SAP OAuth server for the token endpoint, which is the IP address and the port of my backend system. So with this, we can actually go back here to our policy. So remember, the policy was only right now in the step to use the on behalf of flow. We got the access token. We actually also returned the access token. But now what we need to do is to continue our flow here. And that's here. So now again, we do a small trace. Then the next step is that we do a trace on this new grant call. So basically this one here that we now call the SAP system with the SAML bearer grant type. So we will call here the grant type SAML to bearer. We will provide the assertion, client ID, and scope. So that's exactly what we're doing here. So we'll call the SAML to bearer. We'll provide the assertion, the client ID, the client scope. This is again just the tracing call so that we can see what's actually happening. Then we do the actual call. So here we really call the SAP backend system. We provide the relevant information, very much like what we did in this manual call. So the client ID, the client secret. Here's our grant type with the SAML to bearer. As a result, we get this bearer token. So remember, the result was, or the response was this access token, which was a much shorter token. We'll store this token here in this SAP bearer token object. So just for tracing purposes, again, we can return this bearer token. So let's just save this again. Let's go back and call or make another call from Power Automate. So I'll just click on Run here again. And now it succeeded, which is perfect. So let's quickly take a look at the trace here. So this was the access token step. Perfect. Then the next one is actually where I get the bearer. So everything is great. Now I have really this access token, which allows me to make the final call to the SAP system. So what I'll do is as a final step, because keep in mind, we're still not using really single sign-on. We're still using this hard-coded username and password. But now, with this final configuration done, with this final call done, we can replace this line here. This line here with the authentication, with the real step that we want to do, that we set the header variable to our SAP bearer token. So very much like what we had already been logging. And then, yeah, we have the header here, and then we make our final call to the backend URL. So let's save this and try to call our service again. Now, remember, we have removed the hard-coded username and password. And if I call this, it failed. Now, what can happen there? Yeah, we're still getting an unauthorized. Now, if we take a look actually at the trace, because this is sometimes a caching issue on the Power Platform side. If I just take this access token here, so this is what we see was created by the API management flow. If I just take this access token, and if I go here to our REST client, if I just hard code now this access token here in the specific call, you can see that the call actually was successful. So the access token is valid. So the error message that we are getting in Power Platform in this specific case is actually not valid. It's still a caching thing. So that's why, again, I really like this possibility to be able to trace and write out the relevant information and then test it in a REST client. So now what I can do is I can just go back in here, and I can either reassign and change the connection, or what I'll do for my scenario now, I'll just add a new connection. I'll call this SSO2. I can use the Entra-ID. I'll use the very same base URL as before. So this is our base URL, and I'll use the app ID, which was this URL in here. And if I create this new connection, so no caching, I obviously need to sign in again. You can just verify. I still have my API management or my API business partners URL here. I can just save this and test the service. So now, without any caching issues, we can see that this time the call was successful. So we really know that the authentication flow from Power Automate via Entra-ID to the SAP system, to the token service on the SAP side with the appropriate user mapping worked. And now we have a real single sign-on flow working.